So let's start and let's create a geo container, and I will just simply name this FX, and this will be our container that has all of our effects inside. This is completely up to you. You can separate your networks into separate containers, but the way I prefer to work is usually to just have all of my effects in one container and then separate the nodes when we come to rendering. But we will get to that later in the course. Before we get started, actually, I want to let you know of some of my settings here. So if we press D on our keyboard, and we can go to the background tab, and I will set the color scheme. You can see that this is set to dark. And in the guides, I will also turn on, I believe this is off by default, so draw time FPS. And also, let's make sure that the geometry information is set to always on, so we can check the voxel information for what object we have selected, and the polygon count and the point count. So this is very helpful, and I usually leave these settings on. Alright, so let's step inside our geo node, and the first thing that I want to do is create a height field. So I'll just drop down a height field, and I'll press P on my keyboard to show my properties, or rather parameters. And let's go ahead and I will make this size. Let's set this to 100 by 100. So we don't really need a very large terrain to work in this project, because I set up the camera in such a way that it's pointing from above, and when we look from above we can see that we only see really a small part of the terrain. So if you were working on a project which has like a camera that's more horizontal, more something like this, and you would need this part here in the back to be filled, then you would probably need a bigger height field. But you know, for the sake of this course, which isn't really about height fields, we will just keep this as a rather small height field. Okay, and I will leave the grid spacing as it is, and I want to create a mask that sort of encapsulates the border, and we can do this with a volume VOP actually. So I'll just drop down here a volume VOP. And in case you are not familiar with height field, a height field is basically just a simple volume. Right, so we can see that there is a field here that's called height and a field that's called mask, and we can edit these fields with standard volume operations. So we will drop this into a volume VOP, and from here let's step inside, and I want to drop down a distance. So I'll drop a distance node, and we will measure the distance from the position of each voxel to the center of our world, which is currently set to 0, 0, 0. So this is fine, so we don't need to edit this P2 input over here, and we don't need to use the density for this. We can just simply plug this into a bind export, and we will export this to the mask field. Alright, so we can see that this turns red, and this is specific for the height fields. So this field, which is called mask, and it's very important that you set this to mask, exactly how it's spelled over here. This is a field that's recognized by all of the height field nodes. So later then when we add, for example, from over here, and I will simply rename this volume VOP to, you know, mask. Let's just keep this simple. And from here, if I were to drop down a height field, so let's type HF noise, so height field noise, we can see that there's an input for the height and an input for the mask. So we are now generating the mask. If I step back here inside, I can fit this range. So currently, let's take a look for our height field, and I'll just press W to get me my wireframe view, and we can see that this will now generate a distance for each voxel that goes from 0, so from the center, all up to 50. So we want to sort of normalize this range from 0 to 1. Let's go back to my mask and turn off a wireframe by pressing W, step inside, and we can simply fit this value with a fit range. And I will actually just promote my source max, so the source min can be kept at 0, promote the source max, and if I step up a level, we can now edit this maximum value, and if I set this to 50, this should now roughly give us a value from 0 to 1, so we sort of normalize this distance value. We can actually just increase this a bit, and we can see how this changes in the viewport. Alright, so let's say that maybe this should be fine. And also I want a sharper contrast maybe, so With this, I can also plug this into a ramp, so I will just use a ramp parameter, which I will set to a spline ramp. And if I go up, let's reset the ramp. If I hold down Control and middle mouse click on this ramp, where it says here, this will now give us the default ramp. And I can now adjust some of these keyframes over here, or these handles for the ramp. And maybe I will just try to increase the contrast a little bit. Let's grab all of these by holding Shift, and I will set the interpolation to, let's say, B-spline. Okay, so we have a smooth gradient and a sharper contrast for our mask. And we can go back and maybe, whoops, let's go back and maybe decrease the maximum value here. Alright, so let's say this is fine. And also I would like to add a little bit of noise to this mask as well. So let's go back inside, and again from the position of the every voxel, let's generate a noise, and I will drop down a turbulent noise and leave this as a 1D noise, and let's leave this as alligator noise. It should be fine. And also plug this into a fit range, so we will want to adjust the values and have control over our noise. And maybe from here I will just add this noise on top of our distance value. So just add this here, and let's maybe decrease the frequency quite a bit, something like this, and maybe increase the roughness a bit. And we can go to our fit and maybe drop down the source min, and maybe just overall decrease the amplitude by decreasing the destination max value over here. And maybe I will just increase the frequency a bit. Okay, and maybe even decrease the destination max. So this should be fine. Let's go back up a level and let's go to our height field noise. So if I preview this, currently it affects the whole height field, and this is why we generated the mask. So if from here we plug this, so the same output we plug into our second input, this will now look at our mask field that we exported over here. This node will only affect the part of the field that has a mask value of 1, or rather above 0. So for the settings of this noise, I will turn off center noise. Alright, so this will now kind of only give us more positive values, and we can see that the amplitude is way too high, so I will just drop down this to maybe a value of 20. Let's see, 20. Alright, so that's much better. And maybe the element size, let's drop this down. Let's maybe drop this down all the way to maybe 35. And we can leave the rest of the settings as they are. Let's maybe increase the resolution of this volume. So I will drop down a HF resample, so high field resample, and maybe I will increase the resolution to ×4. Alright, so we can see now that our voxel size over here, if I turn this on and off, we can see that it goes from 5,000 voxels all the way up to 80,000. So now we have plenty of resolution to increase the detail of our terrain. And let's maybe just actually go back to our height field and increase the resolution by setting the grid spacing to 1 here as well. Alright, so the initial height field that we created, we maybe didn't want such a sparse noise because it's going to be a kind of a close-up shot and we want a little bit more detail. So just increase the grid spacing to 1, or rather decrease it, which will increase the resolution by a factor of 2. Right, so going back to my height field resample where we left off, we can see that we are working with 320,000 voxels, which gives us plenty of resolution. Okay, and from here I will add another height field noise, so I will just type HF noise, plug this in and give this another layer of noise. And for this we won't need to use the mask, I just want a very subtle layer on top of everything, so maybe set the amplitude here to 2 and an element size of 15. And from here I can drop down an HF clear mask, so let's just get rid of this mask for now because we don't need this anymore. And the final thing that we will add here is going to be a height field distort, so HF distort by noise. Okay, and this just adds a little bit more interest to our shape. So let's maybe set this to a lower value of 2 and maybe an element size of 10. Okay, so we can see that I really like this noise. It's a curl noise that goes over all over the terrain, And it's a really fast way to generate a lot more interesting shapes, as you can see if I turn this on and off. Let's maybe go back to our mask volume VOP over here, and I want to maybe decrease a little bit of this noise. So I want the area in the center to be rather flat. So let's go here and maybe go to my turbulence noise, and we can just decrease the amplitude until we get a more clean area here in the center. Not super necessary, but it might help down the line when we do the fracturing. Alright, so this is fine, and from here we can just go ahead and I will save this first as a volume because we will need this later for our collisions, and then we can convert this to polygons. So actually let's just do this right now, and I'll drop down a file cache. And for this we don't need version, and this is not a time dependent cache, and we can just choose a folder here. And I'll name this to hf_vol, so for height field volume, and I'll just press save. And I can also drop down a null, and let's keep things organized, and this is hf volume. Alright, from here, like we said, we will create a, let's turn this into actual usable geometry, so I will drop down a convert height field. And let's preview this and just set this to polygons, and the default settings should be good. So this gives us plenty of resolution to work with. And from here, you can cache this again, and actually let's just cache this again. So I will drag over this file cache node by holding Alt to duplicate it and connect the wires. And this can be HF, let's go with Geo, and press save to disk. And drop down another null, and this can become HF Geo. Alright, so this will take care of our terrain so far.